Chapter 34 is taking a look at the beginning of World War II, the lead up to World War II, and then also the outbreak of war in Europe prior to the United States' entry. Now, to begin with, remember, we're in the midst of an international depression going on. So in the summer of 1933, 66 countries were called together to coordinate efforts against this international depression, to come to London to figure out how we can deal with this international depression. They were focusing on trying to stabilize international currency, how to factor in exchange rates, and what to do with international trade. FDR, though, at the last minute decided not to join in this convention because he was worried that joining in this convention would mean that he would have to make agreements with these other countries that could potentially hurt his inflationary tactics that he had already started. Remember, he had ended the gold standard. He was worried that he would be lured in to having to go back on the gold standard, which might help the international economy but might hurt the United States' economy. So without the United States there, which is obviously one of the more major countries of the world, especially when you're talking about the international economy, the conference essentially collapsed, similar to what we've seen with the League of Nations prior to this. The rest of the conference couldn't come to some sort of an agreement. Obviously, without the United States, there was a major player missing from the game. And so because of this, and not necessarily because of this, but this is another push towards an end to international cooperation, a refocusing on extreme nationalism in the countries of Europe and also in Asia because they can't come to an international agreement. Now, even though there is this mentality that the United States was totally about isolationism during this period of time, that's not 100% true. The U.S. really picked and chose which international participation they wanted to participate in. Obviously, we did not join the League of Nations, but we did create the Washington Conference. We did not go to that London Economic Conference, but we did work with the rest of Latin and South America to really create a new policy, this good neighbor policy. And especially since business during the Great Depression is on a downward spiral, there's not much business to protect when it comes to our intervening with Latin and South America. And so FDR is focusing on achieving better relationships with the other countries here in the Western Hemisphere, or as they called it, a good neighbor policy. He does this by renouncing that Roosevelt corollary. So here's where he really breaks rank with his distant cousin TR, who we've already talked about. We also see an easing up of American intervention in some of these countries. U.S. Marines left Haiti in 1934. Cuba was released from many of their agreements that they were forced from the Platt Amendment, except Guantanamo Bay. The U.S. continues to hold Guantanamo Bay. We lifted controls on Panama in 1936. And instead of going to war, instead of using forced diplomacy in Mexico, the U.S. really tried to work with Mexico when U.S. oil businesses were seized there in 1938. And so as a result of all of these changes to American policy dealing with Latin and South America, Latin America loved Franklin Roosevelt. So I referenced this before, this rise of totalitarianism. Totalitarianism is an extreme form of a dictatorship, complete and total control by one person or a small group of people over every aspect of their country's society, economy, etc. So several things are leading to the rise of these totalitarian regimes in Europe and in the Pacific. First and foremost, that massive depression that was going on. Also add to that post-World War I and how humiliating it was specifically for Germany is going to open the door to the rise of these totalitarian regimes. So the ones that we need to look at, in the Soviet Union, the rise of Joseph Stalin to create a communist dictatorship in the Soviet Union. In Italy, Benito Mussolini came to power in 1922 to create a fascist totalitarian regime. This is fascism. His major goal was to recreate the Roman Empire, to create a Mediterranean empire and start seizing territory. That's going to be important, obviously, when we get to World War II. In Germany, Adolf Hitler comes to power in 1933, and we see the rise of Nazism. Nazism is extremely similar to fascism, adding the component of racial superiority into the mix. But at the heart of it, it is complete control of the government, of the economy, using a secret police to control the society. And his major goal, and we'll talk more about this as it comes, is to create a European empire, to take back territory that had been seized from Germany at the end of World War I and that humiliating Treaty of Versailles, and to restore German people's good feelings about themselves, that we are a great people, that we can be great once again, and we'll talk more about that later on. He wanted to enact his Lebensraum, as it was called, his living space, to take back all these territories, which is obviously going to be the impetus for World War II. And in Japan, a militarist regime comes to power there. Japan had been a democracy prior to this, but with that Great Depression looming over them, the climate was ripe for a military takeover or a coup d'etat. Now, technically, they still retained the emperor, but behind the scenes, it is the military controlling the show in Japan. And so, like I said, to Hitler, the rallying cry for his coming to power is that Treaty of Versailles and using the Depression in order to gain dictatorial powers. You know, these countries they are educated people. They had been democracies at one point. You know, what would it make people fall in line with these people who are bent on dominating their part of the world or total power? It's because it gives them a sense of security. It gives them a sense of we're not the ones to blame. In Hitler's case, we obviously know what's coming. Let's blame other groups. Let's blame the Jews. Let's blame this group to show why we lost in World War I. It wasn't the German people's fault. We're a great people. Let us return to being great and reclaim all of the land that was taken from us, is the claim that Adolf Hitler uses to get our Lebensraum back, as I mentioned. And so in 1936, Hitler and Mussolini signed the Rome-Berlin Axis Treaty. And this is officially the start of the Axis powers. Obviously, we know Japan is added later on. But right off the bat, this right here is a violation of the Treaty of Versailles because Germany was not allowed to create any sort of an alliance with any other country because of what had happened during World War I. Yet even in 1936, the rest of the world did nothing. And we're going to see that repeated over and over and over again. Here you see the big three dictators, Stalin, Hitler, and Mussolini. Now, in 1935, Japan began building up its naval power, disregarding that Washington Naval Conference, disregarding all those 4-power, 5-power, 9-power treaties that they had signed that had required those ratios between warships. They were looking to create a Pacific empire, and they needed to build up their navy in order to do that. So that is one act of aggression to begin with. In 1935, Italy, looking to create their own empire, took the only remaining independent country left in Africa, in Ethiopia, to start their building of an empire. Now, in 1935, the League of Nations is obviously supposed to deal with something like this. Ethiopia appealed to the League of Nations to stop this act of aggression, to put sanctions on Italy, but nothing was done. Even an oil embargo could have been enough to stop Italy at this moment, but the League of Nations did nothing. They were too fearful that any little event is going to jumpstart another world war. Because if you look back to World War I, remember, what started it? You know, there's all these things in place, all these dominoes in place. The one spark that ignites it or pushes those dominoes over was the assassination of that Archduke Franz Ferdinand. You know, the world community, and rightfully so, was worried that any little event could possibly start another world war. Little did they realize that by not stepping in, this is what's actually going to lead us to World War II. Throughout all of this, the United States is focusing on isolationism. We are not going to be lured into any more foreign entanglements. Remember, we'd gotten engaged in a European affair in World War I. By this point, most Americans felt that World War I was a mistake, and we're not getting dragged in again. So instead, the United States is focusing on neutrality. In 1934, like I said, we felt that World War I was a mistake. So Congress created the Nye Committee, headed up by Senator Gerald Nye, to look at the causes of World War I. What the Nye Committee said was that the reason the United States got involved was because American bankers and businesses profited from this war. And we were really pushed through propaganda and other events to join in this war. They said, never again. We are going to take the profit incentive out of war in order to avoid future wars. And so in 1935, 1936, and 1937, Congress passed different neutrality acts. Now, each of them did something a little different, but all in all, what you need to know is that they decided that all warring nations would now be considered belligerent, meaning countries at war, we're not going to deal with them. We are not going to sell to them. You can't travel on a ship of a country at war. You can't trade, etc. And the whole goal here is to avoid war at all costs. But what is not made, there is not a distinction made between who is the aggressor and who is the victim. All countries at war are now considered belligerent. So in a case of Italy, we would have seen Italy and Ethiopia on the same foot. We would have not engaged in anything with either country for fear of being dragged into yet another war. Now, other forms of aggression. Over in the Pacific, remember, Japan is looking to create this Pacific empire. Specifically, they set their eyes on Chinese Manchuria and also China as well. But they have to come up with some sort of an excuse for invading China, that they can get past the League of Nations. Because it's 1937. They don't know what the League of Nations is actually going to do. So Japan staged an attack on their own railroad line that was in Manchuria and then blamed it on China. This is a very flimsy excuse, but this is supposed to give them enough of an excuse for why they are allowed, quote unquote, to attack China. The reality is people realized what was going on. This is very flimsy, but nonetheless the Japanese stood behind this as their valid reason for invading into China. In response to this, FDR gives his famous quarantine speech in 1937 in Chicago. This is not just aimed at Japan, but also the Italian aggression in Ethiopia as well. He advocated for an economic quarantine on aggressor nations. He says, forget complete neutrality. That's stupid. We need to focus our attention on who is the aggressor nation versus who is the victim in these scenarios, and then quarantine the aggressor nation. A quarantine basically means to isolate them, to cut them off with trade or cut them off with money or loans or whatever it is. So if you think of a virus, you often hear of people being quarantined with a virus. Somebody who has a bad disease, they are quarantined, they are separated, they are put in a separate room so that that disease can't then spread. Immediately following his quarantine speech, in which he essentially likened the aggressor nations to a disease, there was instant opposition. Many Americans are still like, no, absolutely not. It is isolationism no matter what. We are still going to ensure that one country versus another, they're all belligerent. We are not yet ready to say aggressors are bad, the victims we should help out, because we're not getting dragged into yet another war. 1935, Hitler once again violated the Treaty of Versailles by reoccupying the Rhineland. The Rhineland is a small amount of territory, obviously around the Rhine River, that had been taken from them at the end of World War I. Historically, the Rhineland had been where there had been a lot of heavy industry. It also was supposed to serve as a buffer zone for France because, as you remember, France had been invaded in the last war. Once again, nobody did anything, and Hitler continued to grow his army at this point. In 1938, the Nazi army marched in unopposed into Austria and joined them with his country, making them part of the Third Reich, as it was called. The Third Reich, this stands for the Third Great Empire. He is using history to make people feel good about themselves. Remember, the Germans are a great people, according to Hitler. We were once great, hearkening back to the historical days. The first great empire that we had, according to Hitler, was the Holy Roman Empire. The second great empire, or the second great Reich, was under Bismarck in the 1800s. We can be the third Reich, a third great empire that can last 1,000 years. Feel good about yourselves, German people, is the message. So by seizing control of Austria, now Hitler has acquired the center of Europe. He marched in unopposed. In fact, many Austrians welcomed them in with open arms. But this in and of itself is another violation of the Treaty of Versailles. He was not supposed to ever join together Germany and Austria again, because remember, those were the two major alliances in World War I. But nonetheless, the world community still did nothing as Hitler marched in unopposed, meaning that he's going to continue to push further and further and further because nobody is stopping him yet. Here you see the location of the Rhineland over there in the west, and also where Hitler is going to focus on the seizure of Austria just to the south of him and to capture all of the center of Europe. Here is the Nazi army marching in unopposed into Austria, adding them to the Third Reich.